Hey yo, it's Retro. Welcome to another video, y'all. Yeah, y'all saw the title. I'm talking about a really hot debate right now. It's something that I really like, that's really struck me lately. This whole thing has started because of the history of DC Universe. A new book by Mark Waid, Chris Samney, and like a whole bunch of like artists. Look, I'm not, I'm not literally questioning the importance of lore, but I do feel like the general comic book audience has started to stray further and further away from the plot, literally, disproportionately valuing the quality of a story and how it works within the history of its universe. Both of these components are, of course, important. With the properly built world and history, events that happen in the story can have more weight with that history and context. I literally talk about how that affects the power of fantasy and why it's so good in my huge discussion with Dan linked above. However, lately there seems to be a tendency to value comic book lore significantly more than the story and message a writer is attempting to convey. And that disproportionation can swing both ways. But if I'm gonna be honest, I would take that pendulum swinging towards story quality way more than comic book lore. I'm gonna be real, like upholding lore is important, but to what extent? If a writer's trying to tell a story, I'm gonna read the story for what it is. Like I said, this is coming from DC's recently published The History of the DC Universe, a giant undertaking by Mark Waid, looking to plot and set right the history of the DC Universe, something that has always kind of been a hot topic ever since Crisis on Infinite Earths. We've all heard it. DC reboots all the time. They really don't. It's been like 2 times they've rebooted, but really, it's no secret that DC's history is a jumbled mess. Like, that is true. That much is true. It's a mess of like multiple events that have constantly tried to fix the previous one, tried to fix its continuity, only for it to ultimately been all for naught because another writer comes later to further fix it again, and usually they fuck it up entirely. I'm looking at you, Flashpoint and Dark Crisis. Dark Crisis really didn't fuck up anything, but it was just a bland attempt at like making everything matter again. Like it was redundant. It was a very redundant story, but that's besides the point. This drastically contrasts Marvel's history, which is constantly not addressed, but a lot of things are still set in stone. Like the fact that Captain America fought in World War II alongside the original Human Torch and Namor, ushering in the age of superheroes, and then the Avengers forming like 20 or so years later and discovering him from the ice. Like, all of that is still intact and has never changed, and I feel like Marvel is all the better for it. Every reboot attempt by Marvel has failed miserably, and I am so excited for that because they need to not reboot. I will say though, Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman, the reboot that should have followed that, I would have been interested. But we didn't get that. We got All New, All Different Marvel, which was not even a reboot whatsoever. But let's just say the ending of Onslaught, ushering in Heroes Reborn. I'm glad a reboot didn't happen after that. I'm glad nothing happened after that. Those 2 events, those 2 seminal moments in Marvel's history, like seemed like the publisher were heading towards like a line-wide reboot. And even with the Heroes Reborn, like we had an entire line of comics drawn and written by some of the worst comic creators in comics history. Thank God those didn't continue. Onslaught was a crazy event, and you know, Franklin Richards' Pocket Dimension was even more crazy. But even through all of that, I can't really say I ever felt like Marvel needed to chart their history. Like, we've had a history of the Marvel Universe. A lot of people like it. Mark Waid might have been in his bag during that. But for this, DC doesn't quite like, I think the problem with Marvel is that, like, not the problem, I think the best attribute of Marvel that has been kept intact is the fact that, like, it's the wider universe of Marvel is the world outside your window. Like, that's how it's supposed to feel. It's supposed to feel like you can tangibly, like, touch these characters, and you can tangibly, like, feel these characters and how they're represented emotionally and personally. DC does have that attribute at times, but there are a lot of fictional cities, and there's a sort of lack of like sliding timelines. So it is hard to depict the fact that like these people are really tangible. So with all that, like, one might ask, why would DC even think their continuity is so confusing to begin with? To have a book like History of DC Universe to set things right. If you've been living under a rock, you know, this all really started back, This all really started back in the 40s. DC Comics began with a world and roster of heroes, a part of the Justice Society. Alan Scott Green Lantern, Jay Garrick Flash, Hawkman, the Spectre, Dr. Fate, a lot more. DC still published comics of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. They were all a part of the Justice Society. They were all a part of the world that DC was publishing at this time. And there was a moment though when the JSA just stopped appearing, and we would be later introduced to new versions of these characters. We had a new Green Lantern in Hal Jordan. We had a new Flash in Barry Allen. This marked Jay Garrick and all heroes of the golden age of DC designated to Earth 2. And Barry Allen and all the heroes of DC's Silver Age be designated to Earth 1. That wasn't designated until much later, but that's just how I'm going to designate it right now. There was a crossover, and that was, if you didn't know, that was the Flash of Two Worlds. A crossover that introduced the idea of the multiverse to DC and would sort of be the beginning of all of their problems, because now with the emergence of the new Earth 1, all of the comics publishing from the 60s until Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 80s would be considered to be a part of Earth 1. That really made this confusing because Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman existed. Bruce Wayne as Batman, Clark Kent as Superman, and Diana Prince as Wonder Woman, they were all being published during the 40s. And they would all also be Justice League of America members. So how did this all fit? DC's history is long, it's sprawling, and really I explain all of this to give you a basis as to why DC felt like Crisis on Infinite Earths was necessary. This whole entire idea that like we needed to destroy the multiverse to make sure we have one universe, really consolidate everything, the entire history of DC into one universe, one Earth, recontextualizing everything and effectively rebooting the entire line of Marvel for the most part. The only people that didn't reboot were the Flash. Like the Flash was really the only one that didn't reboot. Like Batman got a whole new origin in Batman Year One, which was phenomenal. Frank Miller, David Mazzucchelli, one of the best Batman stories ever, fundamentally revolutionizing Batman comics forever, both in tone and popularity. You also had George Perez's Wonder Woman, which not only created a new origin for her, but portrayed her as a relatively new hero. So like everybody's starting fresh. This is also significant because Superman was often noted as the first superhero or the first significant superhero. But then Man of Steel happened, and John Byrne's version of a retelling of Superman's origin kind of changed the course entirely for Superman. But post Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Justice Society of America were relegated back to the 40s as being the first superheroes that sprang up during World War II. So no longer is Superman the first superhero. And he is a modern superhero now, and he is instead inspired by the JSA, which I actually don't mind. It's not like a big deal to me, but you know, it is what it is. This did work for a long time though, but you would still get some confusion because like, how were the Trinity a part of the JSA? How were they like existing back then? Don't worry about it, basically. Don't worry about it. I'm a big proponent of don't worry about it to me. Eventually this would cause multiple events to look to reintroduce the multiverse. You had an Infinite Crisis, then you had Final Crisis, then you had New 52, then you had Rebirth. You had all of these different events that would like just change, that would like constantly try to fix DC's continuity. And to say it's a mess is really like downplaying it, honestly. It's always been a big debate and a huge misconception that DC has had too many reboots, like I said earlier, but it's really only had two: post Crisis on Infinite Earths and then New 52. Really, the Earth that we've been on, the Earth that DC Comics has been publishing on since New 52 has been the same. Even with Rebirth, it's still the same Earth. They just changed the name. Truthfully, I do understand this need to course correct history and make everything fit, especially with Dark Knight's Death Metal introducing this idea of the entire publication history of DC actually being canon, and that it restored those memories for everyone. It's this idea that the world of DC, the world that we're publishing comics on, like, it's been different. Like, the reason why Batman is still 35 is because the world was destroyed in 1985, because the world was destroyed after Flashpoint, or was changed irreversibly back in Flashpoint. It's because of that Batman is still young, not the fact that like we've been rebooting. And I actually like that idea that like Batman remembers everything dating back to 1940s, just that he's been revived multiple times. It's kind of like daunting. It's kind of like a huge existential crisis that I wish they explored more. But let's not get into that. Let's get into like the history, the real history. Look, the idea that like the destruction and reconstruction of Earths, the heroes and humankind have new lifespans and were essentially reborn physically with New 52. It's an amazing blanket statement. It's an amazing blanket statement. But when you start to try to micromanage almost 100 years of comics that has been managed and edited by hundreds of people, quite literally, this idea that everything is canon works more to me because, yeah, everything did happen. There's no reason to erase what previous writers did to these characters. You don't need to recontextualize everything to fit into this like one little thing. Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were a part of the JSA. And now they're not, because this world is new. There's a new history of the DC universe. I think the history of the DC universe took the wrong lesson from both Dark Knight's Death Metal and History of the Marvel Universe. It's very ironic that Mark Waid wrote that as well. The issue that arises is when you try to make sense of the entire history. At the end of the day, these are comics set in a fictional world and universe. The timeline, sequence, and events, they matter, but they don't matter so much that you need to micromanage that stuff. We all know that JLA first teamed up to fight Starro almost a century ago. And we also had New 52's version fight Darkseid. Like, these are things that happen. We know that, like, we can just read these comics and understand that, like, these are two completely separate events that basically happened at completely different timelines on the same Earth that was destroyed and reconstructed. These are stories that both take place, and trying to say one is the true first JLA team up basically erases the idea that the reboot symbolizes the destructions of Earth that has happened over the many years. The Justice League of America fighting Darkseid for the first time is not a great idea, but it happened. But I really like, I don't care that this new history of the DC universe kind of says that that happened, while also saying that Cyborg was a part of the Justice League, but he was also a part of the new Teen Titans. Like, that's where you kind of just like, you mess things up, you know? To me, it's extremely awesome to have like this idea that DC was destroyed multiple times. Like, with it being so fictional, you can do stuff like that to keep the idea of reboots alive as a meta commentary. History should be malleable. We should abide by it, but if a writer comes along and wants to do something, they should be allowed to. It doesn't invalidate the previous 80 years of comics just because one comic comes in and does something different. A really good example of this, as a matter of fact, right now currently Chip Zdarsky has a Captain America run that's only 2 issues in, but it's a series that takes place right after Cap emerges from the ice, and you can tell everything is as it seems with Iron Man's armor design. It really does feel like it's from the 60s. You think that it's 60s era Marvel, but then you realize that this actually takes place sometime after 9/11. And really, this story so far is more so showing the contrast between Steve and a new Captain America who was radicalized from 9/11 and took the wrong message looking up to Steve Rogers when it came to patriotism. A story that really kind of says fuck all to canon is just rewriting Cap's history to tell a pretty important story so far about how some people viewed the conflict in the Middle East back then. Now, this series is literally too early to tell if execution will be done well, but the point stands. You can change some things to still tell a very important message and to tell a very important story. I say a lot of this not to slander or disrespect Mark Waid and the creative team behind this book, but to question, what is the point of this? Like, genuinely, who is this for? We've had encyclopedias before. Like, this doesn't have to be a comic book. This could just be like a book that you release to Barnes and Nobles, and people will buy it to like know more about the universe, but it doesn't have to be a comic book that's like telling a story from the perspective of Barry Allen trying to chart the history of the universe. Like, Mark Waid has always been a writer that used continuity to his benefit to tell compelling stories, especially his Flash run that is still extremely revered and took small bits from significant plot lines and expanded upon them to create something entirely new. And while I do realize that his Flash run is almost 40 years old, but he's also had a brilliant Daredevil run, and more recently co-wrote one of the best Avengers stories, Avengers No Surrender. To produce and publish a comic book that is nothing more than a giant encyclopedia without just labeling and releasing it as such when it is complete is kind of insane to me. The history of the DC universe isn't a story. It's 4 issues of Mark Waid just chronicling the history of DC Comics and stroking his ego of being this big historian of comics. I kind of really despise this because, like, what's the message that you're telling? That you understand everything about DC while still changing everything about DC? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Just leave it as it is. I feel like Scott Snyder and company did a really great job of that in Dark Knight's Metal and Dark Knight's Death Metal. this huge meta commentary about the history of DC Comics and about reboots and how that affects the world of DC, you could have just left it there. And because to me, at the end of the day, the job of a comic book is to tell a story through a visual medium. How that fits into its universe's history or lore can be sorted out another time or not. It really shouldn't matter so much as long as the story the person is telling makes sense. There is, of course, side effects that may hinder it, like if historically there are inconsistencies, but DC is primarily a fictional world with the history that hardly mirrors our own. Like, I don't like it, it's very different. How one writer interprets the history of DC and how it fits into their story will differ to how another writer does. And to me, that's what makes comic book shared universes interesting and worth talking and discussing about, and worth enjoying, really. The history of the DC universe leaves no room for discussion other than reaction towards what did or didn't happen and when. Other than the fact that like we can look at this book and be like, okay, this is what happened. A comic book having a bad story that doesn't make sense is fixable. You can dissect where a writer went wrong and analyze what they were trying to do, and then later you can kind of like change things to make it work. There's some substance there at least surrounding the comic and what it's trying to say. Like Nightwing by Tom Taylor, which I famously dislike. There is a huge issue when he introduces a new sister to Dick Grayson. Why do superheroes always have to have a secret sister? It's besides the point. And he introduces this idea that Dick Grayson's father cheated on his wife and had a daughter with a Zuko, whatever. It's so like nonsense, like it didn't have to happen. And what do you do from there? You do nothing. Tom Taylor does nothing with the character Melinda, and instead just like she's just in the book. She has no agency in the story. But then you have Dan Waters come in and he's like, okay, like we see that there are characters in this story that like are kind of important and that should be important. And now Melinda Zuko is a very important character to the story. She is opposing Nightwing at certain points, and she is really having agency in the story and how the Zani takes over Bloodhaven. Like, it is important. Like, she is very much a character now. She's not just like a design, basically. She's not just like an idea. She is a actual character who is tangible in the story and makes a change that, while like she's not a bad person, but she has to do what she has to do as mayor. And Nightwing opposes her, and now they're on like two opposite sides, and you know, now the Zani run Bloodhaven. So it's like you can change things to make them fit into your story later and make them work. But this comic is just a writer telling me history, and I don't know about y'all, but a lore book is only interesting when it expands on a story being told, and nothing about this expands even on what is going on in Mark Waid's books. Like, Mark Waid has like 5 different books coming out right now, and none of them are being expanded upon with this History of DC Universe book. Like, it's insane to me. Lore books should be supplementary. They shouldn't be the main course. There could have been an incredible opportunity here to make things interesting for Mark Waid's other books, because honestly, I'm not vibing with any of them. World's Finest is kind of like a nothing burger of a book, and whatever else he's doing, I actually can't remember for the life of me. But unfortunately, I just think my time of liking Mark Waid comics has ended. His time recently has just been reheated nachos of Grant Morrison's DC work and his own in Silver Age DC. Like, it's nothing interesting. It's nothing important. It's nothing that's like trying to say something, and it's very unfortunate. There was fun stuff at the beginning, like World's Finest at the beginning was very interesting. It was very fun. Mostly novelty, and because he has great artists attached to his books, but over time they ended up having nothing to say, and his insistence on writing stories set in the past, like his Action Comics and World's Finest, while just being an Adventures of Blank book, it just doesn't interest me. And I think the History of DC Universe is just another one of those. I'm not interested in the lore book unless it's supplementary. Like, it's cool if like Mark Waid was writing a book that kind of went hand in hand with his Action Comics comic, where he's, you know, when he's writing Superboy, or his World Finest book where, you know, it's Batman and Superman set in the 70s, but like it's not that. It's not complementary to those at whatsoever. It would have been interesting if it was, though, but oh well. Safe to say, like, I don't think I'll be reading any of his books. I'm just not interested. Lore is interesting when you do something with it, not when you're just telling it. Like the lore in Elden Ring, for example. way left field, but that complemented the story. It's a shame. I kind of really despise this book. It's a book that is kind of like that kind of displays what is wrong with a lot of comic book discourse, but it is what it is. If y'all are new, please like, subscribe, comment what you guys think about the new history of DC Universe. If you guys care, if y'all are even reading it. I read the first issue and I was just like, that just made me like, you know, want to make this video, because I was just like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Like, I'm not reading this at all. I'm good. But yeah, I'll catch y'all next video, man. Peace.